The day of the inheritance meeting, my daughter-in-law Vanessa smirked across the polished mahogany table. She told me that with my wife gone, my only job was to sign the company over to her son and find a nice quiet place to fade away. I just smiled the way my Clara taught me to when facing a fool's gambit. What she didn't know was that in my briefcase I had a single sheet of paper, a lab report that would not only deny her every penny, but would rewrite our entire family history. Before I tell you how that single piece of paper detonated a lifetime of lies, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And please like and subscribe if you believe that truth, no matter how long it's been buried, always finds the light. The silence in our home in the days after we buried Clara was not an absence of sound. It was a physical presence. It filled the chairs where she used to sit, seeped into the floorboards, and hung in the air, like a fine dust coating every memory. For 70 years, I had lived a life full of noise. The roar of the saws in my first workshop, the laughter of a young son learning to ride a bike, the constant comforting hum of Clara's presence beside me. Now the quiet was deafening. The house, a sprawling colonial we had built together on a hill overlooking the city, felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that had suddenly ended. I'd find myself walking into the kitchen expecting to smell coffee brewing, or into the garden expecting to see her tending her roses. Each time the emptiness hit me like a physical blow. It was during one of these quiet, aimless afternoons about a week after the funeral that Mark and Vanessa arrived. They didn't call first. The doorbell chimed through the silent house, a shrill, unwelcome sound. I opened the door to find them standing on the porch, their expressions a poorly rehearsed mix of sympathy and impatience. Mark, my son, couldn't quite meet my eyes. He mumbled something about checking in on me. Vanessa, however, looked right past me, her gaze sweeping across the foyer, as if she were assessing an asset. I led them into the living room, the one Clara had decorated with so much care. They sat on the pristine white sofa, looking utterly out of place. I offered them coffee, which they refused. There was an awkward pause, the kind of silence that waits to be filled by an agenda. Vanessa filled it. "James," she began, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "We've been so worried about you rattling around in this big house all by yourself." I didn't respond. I just sat in my armchair, the one opposite Clara's, and waited. And of course, she continued, "We've been thinking a lot about the future. About stability. For the family. For Leo." The mention of our grandson was a calculated move. She was framing her greed as grandmotherly concern. I looked at Mark. At 47, he still looked like a boy who had been dressed by his mother, uncomfortable in his expensive suit. He was the head of sales at Callahan Interiors, the company I had started from nothing, in a rented garage, but he had none of my fire. He had his mother's gentle nature, but without her inner strength. Now sitting next to his wife, he just looked weak. He shifted his weight, avoiding my gaze, tracing patterns on the carpet with his shoe. "The company needs a clear path forward," Vanessa pressed on. "Mark has been working so hard, and with everything that's happened, well, a sense of security would be good for him. For all of us." The implication was clear. My time was over. My grief was an inconvenience, a brief mandatory waiting period before the real business could begin. The business of transferring my life's work into their hands. I didn't say a word. My sorrow was a heavy cloak, and in that moment, I was too weary to shrug it off and fight. I simply nodded and let the silence answer for me. They took my silence as agreement, as the weakness of a grieving old man. When they left, Vanessa gave my arm a little pat, a gesture of condescending triumph. I closed the door behind them, and the crushing silence of the house rushed back in colder and heavier than before. A few more weeks passed. The sympathy cards stopped arriving. The neighbors stopped dropping off casseroles. The world, it seemed, was moving on, and I was expected to move on with it. The shock of loss had begun to recede, leaving behind a constant dull ache in my chest. It was on a Tuesday morning, as I was paying some bills in my study, that the phone rang. It was Vanessa. There was no warmth in her voice this time, no pretense of concern. It was brisk, all business. James, I need to talk to you about something. I leaned back in my leather chair, the one Clara had bought me for my 50th birthday, and listened. Mark and Leo are not handling this well, she said, her tone sharp. The stress has been immense. They're exhausted. We all are. We need to get away to process our grief properly. I could hear the faint sound of a television in the background on her end of the line. It didn't sound like a house in mourning. We found a wonderful trip, she continued. A month in Europe, Italy, France. It would be so healing for us, a chance to reset. I waited for the point, though I already knew what it was. The thing is, James, we're a little tight on cash right now. I was hoping you could authorize a transfer from the company. A bonus for Mark, perhaps, for all his hard work. Say $50,000, it would cover everything. $50,000 for a grief vacation. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. She wanted to use the money from the company that Clara and I had bled for, sacrificed for, to fund a luxury holiday, while the scent of my wife's funeral flowers had barely faded from our home. Something inside me, something that had been dormant and buried under a mountain of sorrow, began to stir. It was a cold, hard anger. For 40 years I had been the provider, the protector. Clara had been the heart, the diplomat. She always smoothed things over, always found the middle ground. But she was gone. There was no middle ground left. There was only this raw, shameless avarice. I thought of my employees, men and women who had been with me for decades, who depended on the company for their livelihoods. I thought of the promises I had made to them, and the promise I had made to myself to honor what Clara and I had built. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silence between us with the force of a gavel. There was a pause on her end of the line. What did you say? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. I said no, Vanessa, I repeated, and this time my voice was stronger, forged in the sudden fire of my anger. The company's funds are for the company's business, not for vacations. She sputtered for a moment, utterly blindsided. How dare you? After everything we've been through, this is about family. Mark is your son. Mark gets a generous salary, I said, my voice level. If he wants a vacation, he can pay for it himself. I could hear her breathing sharp and ragged with fury. You will regret this, James, she hissed, and the line went dead. I placed the phone back in its cradle, my hand perfectly steady. The fight had come sooner than I expected, but I was ready for it. I didn't have to wait long. That evening, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, their car screeched into my driveway. They didn't bother with the doorbell this time. I heard the front door open and slam shut. I was in my study, and I stood up from my desk as they stormed into the room. Vanessa's face was a mask of fury. Mark trailed behind her, looking miserable, his eyes fixed on the floor. What was that on the phone today? Vanessa demanded, her voice shrill. Who do you think you are? I looked past her directly at my son. Mark, I said, my voice quiet. Is this what you want, to come into my home and have your wife yell at me? Mark flinched, but said nothing. He couldn't look at me. That was his answer. His silence was his allegiance. Vanessa stepped forward, planting her hands on my desk. She was shorter than me, but her rage made her seem larger. Don't you talk to him, you talk to me. For years we have sat back and waited for you to retire, to step aside and let the next generation take over. We have been patient. We have been respectful. Her words were so detached from reality, they were almost laughable. But I wasn't laughing. Clara was the only thing holding this family together. With her softness, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. She was always protecting you, making excuses for your stubbornness. She was the buffer. But now she's gone, James. The buffer is gone, and you need to face reality. That company, this house, everything, it belongs to Mark. It is his birthright. Your time is over. I let her words hang in the air, listening to them echo in the quiet room. And in that moment I looked at my son, pleading with my eyes for him to speak, to show a flicker of loyalty, of love, of the decency his mother had tried so hard to instill in him. He just stood there, a silent, miserable statue, a willing accomplice to his wife's cruelty. And that's when I knew. The grief for my wife didn't disappear, but a new feeling settled in beside it, cold and sharp as glass. It was clarity. I saw them, truly saw them, for the first time. The family I thought I had was an illusion, a fragile peace treaty maintained by one woman's boundless love. Now that she was gone, the war had begun, and they had just shown me without a shadow of a doubt that there would be no prisoners. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. A new cold resolve settled into my bones. "I understand," I said softly. "I understand completely." The confrontation with Mark and Vanessa left a scar. It wasn't the anger that lingered, but the profound sense of dislocation. They had stood in my study, a room filled with a lifetime of shared memories with Clara, and tried to declare that life null and void. They had tried to reduce my existence to a signature on a transfer document. That night, sleep offered no escape. I lay in our large empty bed, listening to the house settle each creak and groan, a reminder of its emptiness. Clara's side of the bed was cold. I was adrift in a life I no longer recognized, and I felt an overwhelming need to find my bearings, to anchor myself to a time when things made sense, when love was not a negotiation and family was not a battlefield. That's what led me to the attic the next morning. The air was cool and still smelling of cedar and decades of stored memories. Sunlight streamed through the single round window at the far end, cutting a golden path through the dusty air, illuminating floating motes like tiny forgotten stars. Everything up there was a piece of our history. The old rocking horse with one ear missing that Mark had adored. Stacks of vinyl records from our courtship. A tower of National Geographic magazines I always swore I'd read again someday. Under a white sheet stood the ghostly silhouette of Clara's old sewing table, where she'd hemmed countless pairs of pants for a growing boy and stitched Halloween costumes with meticulous care. I came up here seeking solace, seeking her. I needed to feel the texture of our life together, to remind myself that the ugliness of last night was an aberration, not the sum of our existence. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn wood of the rocking horse, a faint smile touching my lips. I remembered Mark's squeals of laughter, his small hands gripping the handles for dear life. How could that joyful little boy become the silent, defeated man who stood by while his wife tried to tear me down? The question hung in the dusty air unanswered. I moved deeper into the attic towards the corner where Clara kept her personal keepsakes. There were boxes filled with photo albums, her college yearbooks, neatly labeled containers of Mark's childhood art projects. I sat on an old trunk, the leather cracking under my weight, and opened the top photo album. There we were, young and impossibly optimistic on our wedding day. There was Clara holding a tiny bundled Mark in the hospital, her face glowing with a love so fierce it seemed to radiate from the glossy paper. I traced the outline of her face with my finger. This was real. This had happened. This was the foundation of my life. I spent what felt like hours there, losing myself in the curated chapters of our past. It was a bittersweet journey. Each happy memory was now tinged with the sorrow of her absence and the fresh pain of my son's betrayal. As I was putting the last album away, my hand brushed against a loose floorboard just beneath the shelving unit. It was almost imperceptible, but it shifted slightly. Curiosity, a feeling I hadn't experienced much lately, nudged at me. I knelt down the floorboards, groaning in protest, and worked my fingers into the crack. The board lifted easily, and there, nestled in the dark space below, was a wooden box. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, made of a dark, rich cedar with a small, tarnished brass latch. I had never seen it before in my life. This was not one of the familiar containers filled with Christmas ornaments or old tax records. This was hidden, deliberately. I lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. For a long moment I just stared at it, a strange feeling of trespass washing over me. This was a secret. Clara's secret. A part of her life she had chosen to keep completely separate from me. My first instinct was to put it back to respect her privacy, to let the dead keep their mysteries. But the echo of Vanessa's voice, her cruel words about Clara's softness, stopped me. She had tried to paint a picture of my wife as a simple, gentle soul who enabled me. But Clara was complex, intelligent, and evidently a woman with secrets. Maybe understanding her secret would help me understand the mess my life had become. Maybe somewhere in this box was a truth I needed to know. With a sense of trepidation that felt like a cold weight in my stomach, and I carried the box over to the beam of sunlight. I sat down on the floor, the dust clinging to my trousers, and I lifted the latch. The inside of the box smelled of dried flowers and old paper. On top lay a pressed gardenia, brown and brittle with age, her favorite flower. Beneath it was a small black and white photograph of a young man with dark, wavy hair and a confident smile. It wasn't me. It wasn't anyone I knew. And under the photo, there were letters. Dozens of them tied in neat bundles with faded blue silk ribbon. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in the silent attic. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the first bundle. The envelopes were yellowed, the stamps bearing the likeness of a president long gone. The postmarks were from nearly 50 years ago, from the year before Clara and I met. I carefully untied the ribbon and slid the first letter from its envelope. The paper was thin, almost translucent. The handwriting was a strong, masculine script. The ink faded from black to a soft gray. "My dearest Clara," it began. I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Jealousy, intrusion. I read on. The letter was beautifully written, full of passion and shared dreams, references to books they were both reading, and plans for a future together. It was signed, "Forever yours, Richard." I sat there for a long time reading through that first bundle. It was a portrait of a passionate, youthful love affair. A part of me was hurt, a primal sting of knowing she had loved someone else so deeply. But another larger part of me felt a profound sadness for her. For whatever reason, this love had ended, and she had packed it away, buried it under the floorboards of our life together. I almost stopped there. I almost tied the ribbon back around those letters, put them in the box, and hid it away again, leaving her youthful ghost to rest. But my hand, almost of its own accord, reached back into the box. There was another smaller bundle at the very bottom, tied with a different, darker ribbon. I picked it up. My blood ran cold. The postmark on the top envelope was clear. It was dated 2 years after Clara and I were married. My hand holding the second, smaller bundle of letters was trembling. The blue ribbon around the first bundle had felt like a relic of a youthful, forgotten romance. This one, tied with a dark, almost black ribbon, felt like a secret that had been kept during my marriage, during our life together. The date on the postmark, clear as a scar, was from the autumn of 1978, 2 years after I had stood at an altar and promised my life to Clara and she to me. 2 years after we had bought this very house and dreamed of filling its rooms with the sounds of a family. With a sense of dread that was almost paralyzing, I slid the ribbon off. The paper felt different from the others, thinner, more fragile. The ink on the page seemed darker, as if written with more pressure, more urgency. I unfolded the first page. It was from Richard. Of course it was from Richard. My mind reeled. This wasn't a closed chapter. It was a story that had continued, written in the margins of my own. I began to read, and the dusty sunlit attic transformed into a courtroom where my entire life was put on trial. These letters were different from the first batch. The youthful passion was gone, replaced by a deep, aching melancholy. He wrote about his life in another city, a life that sounded successful on the surface, but was empty at its core. He wrote about seeing a photograph of Clara and me in a local newspaper once in the society pages after a charity event. "You were smiling," he wrote, I hope it was real. For your sake, I truly hope it was. Each word was a carefully aimed dart piercing the bubble of my 47-year marriage. I found myself questioning every memory, every holiday photo, every shared laugh over dinner, every quiet moment we had spent together. Had she been thinking of him when she looked at me? Was she seeing him? The foundation of my world, which had already been fractured by her death, was now beginning to crumble. I read on my breath catching in my chest. He wrote about her pregnancy with Mark. He didn't write with the joy of an outsider, but with the painful longing of an insider who was forced to stand on the curb. I know we agreed it was for the best, one letter said. We agreed that a child deserves a complete home, a father who is present. But Clara, the thought of my child, our child, calling another man father, is a pain I cannot adequately describe. The words blurred. I had to read the sentence again. My child. Our child. A cold wave washed over me so intense it felt like I had been plunged into ice water. It couldn't be. It was a delusion. The ramblings of a heartbroken man who couldn't let go. It had to be. But the seed of a terrible doubt had been planted, and as it took root, it sent out tendrils that wrapped around every memory I had of my son. I dropped the letter and scrambled back through my own mind, frantically searching for proof for anything to refute this. Mark never looked much like me. It was a family joke. Strangers, friends, even my own parents used to say it. He's all Clara. He has his mother's eyes, his mother's smile. No one ever said he had his father's chin or his father's walk. I had always dismissed it. Children are their own people, I told myself. But now that simple observation felt like a damning piece of evidence. I remembered Clara's fierce, almost desperate protectiveness of him. I had seen it as a mother's boundless love, but now I saw it through a different lens. Was it love or was it guilt? Was she protecting him from the world, or was she protecting her secret from me? A specific memory surfaced so vivid, it was as if it were happening right in front of me. Mark was about 16, struggling in school, showing no interest in the woodworking business I hoped he would one day inherit. I had been hard on him one evening, frustrated by his lack of ambition. Clara had found me in my study later that night, her eyes red from crying. He can't help who he is, James, she had pleaded. He's not you. You can't expect him to be. Just please love him for who he is. At the time, I thought she was talking about his personality, his interests. But now her words had a chilling new meaning. My hands shook as I reached for the last letter in the bundle. The envelope was thinner than the rest, containing only a single sheet. The paper felt different, heavier. The date was from the spring of 1979, just a few months after Mark was born. This was it. The final piece. The letter was a farewell. Richard wrote that he was moving to the West Coast, that he couldn't stay so close anymore. It was too painful. He wrote that he would never contact her again, that he was setting her free to live her life. And then I saw it. The final paragraph. The words that would act as the judge and jury for the rest of my life. I read them once, then twice, then a third time, the meaning crashing down on me with the force of a physical collapse. Know that I will go to my grave loving you, Clara. I will always love you and our little boy, even if he carries another man's name. Our little boy. Even if he carries another man's name. The sunlight streaming through the attic window seemed to dim. The air grew thick and heavy, impossible to breathe. The attic was no longer a sanctuary of memories. It was a tomb for the life I thought I had, for the woman I thought I knew, for the son I thought was mine. The quiet hum of the house was gone, replaced by a roar in my ears. 47 years. 47 years of a lie beautifully crafted, meticulously maintained. Every birthday party for Mark, every scraped knee I had bandaged, every proud moment at a school play, every dollar I had invested in his future, it all replayed in my mind, now tainted, recontextualized into a grand, tragic deception. The grief I felt for Clara was twisted into something unrecognizable. It was still there, a profound sadness for the woman I had lost. But now it was tangled with the sharp, bitter thorns of betrayal. Had she ever truly loved me, or was I just the convenient, stable man who could give her child a name and a future, the man who would never know? The anger I had felt towards Vanessa and Mark the night before seemed trivial now, like a child's tantrum compared to this earthquake. Theirs was a simple, ugly greed. This was a betrayal that redefined my entire existence. The fight was no longer about a company. It was no longer about money or a house. It was about the truth. I looked at the letter in my trembling hand. The words seemed to mock me from the page. I had to know. I had to be sure. I folded the single sheet of paper, tucked it into my pocket, and walked out of the attic, leaving the ghost of my marriage behind in the dust and the dark. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I knew my very next phone call. Walking out of the attic was like surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. I moved through my own home like a ghost, my feet silent on the plush carpets. The photos on the walls, once sources of comfort, now felt like accusations. Every smiling picture of Mark of our family was a monument to a lie. The cold resolve that had settled in my bones in the attic was not a feeling of anger. It was something heavier, something more final. It was the feeling of a foundation giving way, and the grim determination to build something new on the rubble, something based on truth, no matter how brutal that truth might be. I picked up my car keys from the hall table and walked out the door, leaving the house and its suffocating silence behind me. The drive into the city was automatic. My hands knew the route, but my mind was a million miles away, rereading the words on that single damning sheet of paper. The city I had watched grow, the city where I had built my business and my life, seemed alien to me now. The familiar landmarks, the buildings whose interiors my company had crafted, meant nothing. They were just brick and steel, a backdrop to a life I was no longer sure I had ever truly lived. David Chen's office was in one of the older, more distinguished buildings downtown, a place of granite and polished brass that projected an aura of permanence and stability. It was exactly what I needed. David had been my lawyer for nearly 40 years, but he was more than that. He was my friend. He and his wife had been at our wedding. I was the godfather to his eldest son. He had held Mark as a baby at his christening, bouncing him on his knee. He was the only person on earth I could trust with this. His secretary, a kind woman who had been with him for decades, showed me into his office with a sad, knowing smile. She knew about Clara, of course. The whole city did. She probably thought my visit was about settling my wife's estate. If only it were that simple. David's office was a sanctuary of order. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound law volumes, a large mahogany desk that was impeccably organized, and the faint, pleasant smell of old paper and lemon oil. He rose from his chair as I entered, his face etched with genuine concern. He was a man my age, with a full head of silver hair and eyes that were both kind and incredibly sharp. He saw something in my expression that went beyond simple grief. "James," he said, his voice soft. He came around the desk and gripped my shoulder. "I'm so sorry. I've been meaning to call." "How are you holding up?" I couldn't answer that question. How was I holding up? I felt like a building that had been hollowed out by an earthquake, still standing, but structurally unsound, ready to collapse into dust at the slightest tremor. Instead of speaking, I simply nodded and walked over to his desk. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small bundle of letters, the ones tied with the dark ribbon. I placed them squarely in the center of his polished desk blotter. David looked from my face to the letters, a question in his eyes. He sat down slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "What's this, James?" he asked. I took a deep breath, the first one that felt like it had reached the bottom of my lungs all day. That I said my voice hoarse is a complication. I proceeded to tell him everything. I told him about the attic, about the box, about the 2 bundles of letters. I spoke in a low, flat monotone, relaying the facts as if I were a witness describing a traffic accident. I kept my emotions locked down tight. If I let even a crack of it show, I knew I would shatter. I told him about Richard, about the letters written before I knew Clara, and then about the ones written after. As I spoke, David listened without interruption. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk, his entire focus on me. He was no longer just a friend offering comfort. He was a lawyer, absorbing information, assessing a situation. When I got to the final letter, the one written after Mark's birth, I couldn't just summarize it. I had to say the words out loud to give them weight in the silent wood-paneled room. The last one was a farewell, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He said he was moving away, and he ended it with this sentence. I looked David straight in the eye. He wrote, "I will always love you and our little boy, even if he carries another man's name." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and obscene. The only sound was the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room. David, a man who made his living with words, was speechless. He slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing for a moment, as he absorbed the full, devastating impact of what I had just told him. He was processing not just the potential legal ramifications, but the 47-year betrayal of his friend. When he opened his eyes again, the kindness was still there, but it was now overlaid with a lawyer's focused intensity. He didn't offer platitudes or empty condolences. He asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want to do, James?" This was the moment my plan, which had been a formless, instinctive thing born of shock and pain, began to solidify. First, I said, my voice gaining strength, "I need to know for sure. I need absolute, undeniable legal proof. I need a DNA test." David nodded slowly. "That's the logical first step. But it's tricky. We can't compel Mark to provide a sample without raising suspicion. It has to be done discreetly. Through abandoned DNA." "Abandoned DNA?" I asked. "Something he leaves behind," David explained. "A coffee cup he drinks from a napkin, a piece of hair from a comb. Something we can collect without his knowledge and send to a reputable lab. It will be admissible later if we establish a clear chain of custody." We spent the next half an hour brainstorming, the two of us hunched over his desk, like generals planning a campaign. The emotional storm of the last 24 hours was being channeled into cold, hard strategy. It was a relief to focus on logistics, on the practical steps of a plan. It kept me from thinking about the abyss that had opened up in my past. We settled on a method, a way to get Mark and Leo to my house for a supposed preliminary chat, a way to secure what we needed. "All right," David said, making notes on a legal pad. "We can set that in motion." He looked at me, his expression serious. "And what's the second step, James? After you know for sure what happens, then?" I leaned forward, my hands flat on his desk. "Second," I said, and my voice was cold as ice. "You are going to call Vanessa. You are going to tell her that I am ready to discuss the future of the company and the estate. You are going to schedule the official inheritance meeting she has been demanding. I want them to walk into that room feeling confident. I want them to feel like they've already won. I want them to lay every one of their greedy cards on the table. And then and only then will we show them our hand." David looked at me for a long moment, a flicker of concern for his old friend in his eyes. But he also saw the unshakable resolve. He gave a single firm nod. "All right, James," he said. "Let them set their own trap. We'll be ready when they do." When I walked out of his office and back into the late afternoon sun, the world still felt alien. But I no longer felt like a ghost in it. I had a purpose. The silent readjustment had begun. The days that followed my meeting with David were a strange paradox. On the surface, my life was a quiet routine of grief. I woke up, made coffee for one, and walked through the silent rooms of my house. But beneath that calm surface, a silent, methodical war was being waged. It began with a phone call. My hand was steady as I dialed Mark's number. It was time to set the trap. Vanessa answered, her voice sharp and suspicious. "What is it, James?" I pitched my own voice to sound weary, conciliatory. "Vanessa, hello?" I was hoping to speak with Mark. There was a muffled sound as she passed the phone, and then Mark's hesitant voice came on the line. "Dad, Mark." I began letting a sigh seep into my words. "I've been thinking about our last conversation. And you were right. Your mother always smoothed things over. I haven't been fair to you, to any of you." I let that hang in the air. On the other end, there was only silence, but I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the suspicion warring with his desire for this to be true. "I was hoping," I continued, "that you and Leo might come over for dinner this Friday. Just the three of us. No lawyers, no pressure. I want to talk to clear the air before we have any formal meetings. I want to understand what you need." I could hear Vanessa whispering urgently in the background. She was buying it. She saw this as the first crack in the dam, the beginning of my surrender. Mark finally spoke, his voice filled with a tentative relief. "Yeah, Dad. That sounds good. We'll be there." I hung up the phone and stood for a long moment in the quiet kitchen. The first move had been made. While I prepared for the dinner, David was fortifying our position. He worked with a quiet, relentless efficiency that I had always admired. We spent hours in his office, a war room of paper and precedent. We went over every document that constituted my life's work. The articles of incorporation for Callahan Interiors, the company bylaws. I had written myself 40 years ago, the deeds to every piece of property, and the complex web of trusts Clara and I had established to protect our assets. David's genius was in seeing the connections, the clauses and subclauses that could be leveraged. He pointed to a line in the corporate charter, a clause Clara had insisted on. It stipulated that a controlling interest in the company could only be transferred to a direct blood heir. At the time, it seemed like a standard sentimental piece of legal boilerplate. Now it was a shield wall. We reviewed Clara's will and my own. They were mirrored documents, each leaving everything to the surviving spouse, and then to our son, Mark Callahan. The name was there in black and white, but David found our opening. The wills were predicated on the legal definition of a son, a definition that could be challenged. He was building a fortress stone by legal stone, ensuring that when the storm came, we would be untouchable. All the while, Vanessa's impatience grew. She called David's office 3, then 4 times a day. Her tone shifted from demanding to condescendingly sweet, convinced she was just a few steps from the finish line. "David, darling," she'd coo to his long-suffering secretary. "Just tell James we're ready whenever he is. We don't want to drag this out for him. It must be so difficult at his age." David would just smile, take the message, and continue his work. Her arrogance was making her blind, and that was our greatest advantage. Friday evening arrived. I set the dining room table, the one we only used for special occasions. I used Clara's favorite china and polished the silver. I cooked roast chicken, Mark's favorite meal since he was a boy. The whole exercise was a surreal performance. I felt like an actor on a stage playing the part of the benevolent father for an audience of 2. They arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. Mark looked nervous, but Leo, my grandson, walked in with an air of entitled boredom, already scrolling on his phone. The dinner was an exercise in tension. I kept the conversation light, telling old stories about the early days of the company, carefully avoiding any mention of Clara. I talked about a new project we were bidding on, a big hotel renovation downtown. I was trying to project an image of a man who was still in control, still vital, but perhaps ready to consider a future with less responsibility. I could see Mark relaxing slightly, starting to believe the fiction I was weaving. Leo barely looked up from his phone. I poured Mark a glass of water from a pitcher. I watched him pick it up, his fingerprints, clear on the smooth, cool surface. I watched him take a long drink. My heart was a stone in my chest. This man, this stranger who had called me father, his entire life was drinking my water at my table while I plotted to prove he was not my son. It was a betrayal, I knew. But it was a necessary one, a response to a much deeper, older betrayal that was still echoing in my soul. After a strained hour of small talk, they made their excuses and left. I walked them to the door, shook Mark's hand, and told him I looked forward to our official meeting. "I think we can come to a very fair arrangement," I said, looking him in the eye. He nodded eagerly, a hopeful smile on his face. He didn't see the ice in my gaze. He only saw what he wanted to see. The moment their car's taillights disappeared down the driveway, my performance ended. I went back to the dining room. There it was. The glass. Sitting on the table half full, a perfect specimen. Following David's meticulous instructions, I pulled on a pair of latex gloves. I carefully picked up the glass, holding it by the stem. I placed it in a large sealable evidence bag. I took a permanent marker and wrote the date, the time, and Mark's name on the bag. The act was so clinical, so detached, it felt like something from a television crime drama. This small, ordinary object now held the power to either confirm my worst fears or expose me as a paranoid old fool. The next morning, I drove to a private courier service and sent the package to the lab David had designated a highly respected facility in another state. There was nothing left to do now but wait for the results and prepare for the final confrontation. The fortress was built. The evidence was on its way. The stage was set. The week I waited for the lab results was the longest of my life. Time seemed to stretch and warp each day, an eternity of quiet, agonizing suspense. I existed in a state of limbo, suspended between two unbearable realities. In one, the life I had built with the woman I adored was a lie. In the other, I was a paranoid, grieving old man, desecrating my wife's memory with a monstrous suspicion. I wasn't sure which was worse. Every time the phone rang, my heart would seize in my chest, a frantic bird beating against my ribs. But it was always a telemarketer or a neighbor calling to offer condolences that now felt like they belonged to another man's life. I spent most of my time in my study. It felt like the epicenter of my new reality. It was the room where Vanessa had thrown down her gauntlet, and the room where I had made the call to David, setting these wheels in motion. I would sit in my leather armchair for hours, staring out the window at the old oak tree in the backyard. Clara and I had planted it when Mark was just a boy. I watched its leaves, now tinged with the first hints of autumn gold, dance in the wind. Everything was the same as it had always been, and yet everything was different. The world outside continued its placid routine, completely unaware that my own world was poised on the brink of collapse. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, the phone rang. The sound was different this time. Sharper, more definitive. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this was the call. I let it ring 3 times, a small, foolish ritual to delay the inevitable. Finally, I picked up the receiver. My hand was slick with a cold sweat. "Hello," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. It was David. I could hear the careful, professional tone in his voice, the practiced calm of a man about to deliver life-altering news. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He said he had just received the email from the lab. He said he had the report in front of him. As he began to speak, the world outside my window seemed to fade away. My entire universe compressed into the black plastic receiver pressed against my ear, and the quiet, measured voice on the other end of the line. I focused on the intricate grain of the wood on my desk, tracing the swirling patterns with my eyes. My knuckles were white where I gripped the phone. My breath was a prisoner in my chest. I felt a tremor start in my hand, a physical manifestation of the tectonic plates of my life shifting beneath me. I was bracing for an impact, for a final definitive blow that would either shatter my suspicion or confirm it. I didn't hear all of David's words. I heard phrases, scientific jargon that felt clinical and brutal. Chain of custody verified, genetic markers, comparative analysis. And then the words that cut through the noise, the words that would be seared into my memory forever. James. I heard him say, his voice full of a gentle sorrow. The probability of paternity is 0%. 0%. The number was so absolute, so final. There was no room for doubt, no sliver of hope to cling to. It was the mathematical equation for a lie. The tremor in my hand stopped. The roaring in my ears faded into a profound, echoing silence. The last desperate hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that the letters were a fiction, that my paranoia was a symptom of grief, vanished completely. It was true. All of it. The life I had lived for the past 47 years was someone else's story. A strange calm washed over me. It was not peace. It was the eerie stillness that comes after a pursuing storm has passed, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. The pain was still there, a vast hollow ache in my chest. But it was no longer a chaotic, overwhelming force. It had crystallized into something hard, cold, and heavy, something I could carry. I had lost my wife. I had lost the son I thought was mine. I had lost my own past. In losing everything, I had lost my fear. My sorrow had become my armor. My betrayal had become my sword. I was no longer the victim of a 47-year-old lie. I was now the agent of its revelation. I was the keeper of a terrible, cleansing truth. David was still talking on the other end of the line, his voice a concerned murmur. He was probably asking me if I was all right, asking me what I wanted to do next. I lifted my gaze from the desk and looked across the room at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of Mark, age 10, proudly holding up a trout he had caught on a fishing trip we had taken. I felt a pang of genuine sorrow, not for myself, but for that little boy. The boy who never knew his real father and who had been raised in a gilded cage of deceit. But the feeling passed. That boy was gone. In his place was a weak man who had stood by and watched his wife try to strip me of my dignity. I put the receiver back to my ear. David had fallen silent, waiting for my response. I took a slow, steady breath. My voice when I spoke was not the voice of a grieving husband or a betrayed father. It was calm, clear, and devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a man giving an order from which there was no appeal. Proceed with the meeting, David. The day of the meeting, I drove to the office, the headquarters of Callahan Interiors, the building I had bought and refurbished myself 30 years ago. I walked through the main workshop, a place that had always felt more like home than anywhere else. The familiar smell of freshly cut oak and varnish filled the air. A few of my older employees, men who had been with me since the beginning, gave me solemn, respectful nods. They knew about Clara. They knew this was a difficult time. They had no idea it was about to become a war. I felt a surge of protective anger. This place, these people, this was my legacy. It was not something to be handed over like a trinket in a will. The boardroom was on the top floor, a large sunlit space with a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the city I loved. In the center of the room was the table. It was my masterpiece, crafted from a single massive slab of black walnut that I had sourced myself 20 years ago. It had taken my best men 6 months to finish and polish it to a mirror-like sheen. It was a table for builders, for creators, for people who understood the value of hard work. When they arrived, they entered not as family, but as a raiding party. Vanessa led the way, dressed in a sharp, ridiculously expensive power suit, her heels clicking decisively on the hardwood floor. She looked around the room with an appraiser's eye, a look of ownership already on her face. Mark followed her like a shadow, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor. And then came Leo, my grandson, who didn't even bother to take his headphones off. He slumped into one of the plush leather chairs at the far end of the table and immediately became absorbed in his phone, a bored prince waiting for his coronation. I took my seat at the head of the table, my customary place, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Vanessa placed a thick, leather-bound binder on the table with a theatrical thud. She was the one who began the meeting. James, she started, her voice a smooth, rehearsed purr. Thank you for agreeing to this. I know this is a difficult time for all of us. Clara? Well, Clara would have wanted a smooth, seamless transition, for the sake of the family and for the sake of the company. The invocation of my wife's name was a desecration. Clara would have been horrified. But I let it pass. I let her play her hand. My face remained a calm, neutral mask. She opened the binder. I've taken the liberty, she said, of preparing a strategic transition plan, a forward-looking document to ensure the long-term stability and growth of Callahan Interiors. She slid a glossy, professionally printed booklet across the table to me. I didn't touch it. I just looked at her, waiting. She cleared her throat and launched into her performance. It was a masterclass in corporate jargon, a cascade of empty words like synergy, leveraging assets, and generational transfer of leadership. She spoke of Mark's supposed vision for the company, a vision I knew for a fact extended no further than the next golf game. Then she got to the heart of the matter, the demands. First, she said, pointing to a graph in her binder, is the transfer of equity. To ensure Mark has the mandate he needs to lead effectively, we're proposing a transfer of 80% of the company's shares into his name. This will secure the Callahan legacy for the next generation for Leo. She gestured vaguely towards our grandson, who was now watching some video on his phone, oblivious. Of course, she continued, flipping a page. We've prepared a generous retirement package for you, James. A pension that is well above the industry standard for a retiring founder. It will allow you to live in complete comfort without the day-to-day burdens of running a business at your age. My gaze flickered to Mark. He was staring intently at a water stain on a coaster, his face pale. He was a passenger in the vehicle of his wife's ambition, and he was too cowardly to even look at the man he was about to run over. I felt a brief, sharp pang of something that might have been pity. It passed quickly. Finally, Vanessa got to the last, most personal point. And then there's the house, she said, her voice softening into a tone of false sympathy. It's a magnificent property, a true family estate, but it's far too large for one person. It needs the life and energy of a family. We believe it's best for the house to be transferred to Mark and me. We've already looked into some lovely high-end retirement communities for you. Some of them even have golf courses. She closed the binder with a crisp final snap. The sound echoed in the silent room. Her performance was over. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her mask of professionalism falling away to reveal the cold, hard avarice beneath. Her eyes were like chips of granite. Her smile was gone. So let's be clear, James, she said, her voice low and sharp. Clara isn't here to soften things anymore. She isn't here to protect you. This is the new reality. You will sign the papers. You will transfer the company to my son, and you will hand over the keys to the house. You will accept the pension we've offered, and you will learn to fend for yourself. It is the natural order of things. The old makes way for the new. She leaned back in her chair, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She had laid all her cards on the table. The ultimatum was delivered. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Mark still refused to look at me. Leo, sensing a shift in the room's atmosphere, finally looked up from his phone, a flicker of mild interest in his eyes. They all looked at me, waiting for me to break, to argue, to plead. They were waiting for the defeated old man to accept his fate. I held their gaze for a long, silent moment. I let the weight of her words settle in the room. Then I gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. My expression was unreadable, and I reached down beside my chair for my own briefcase. It was much thinner than hers. I let her final words hang in the air, allowing the full weight of their arrogance and cruelty to settle into the room. I looked at Vanessa's triumphant face, at Mark's pathetic refusal to meet my eye, at Leo's casual disinterest. They had presented their vision of my future, a quiet, managed decline into irrelevance. They had read me my sentence, and now they were waiting for my surrender. A slow smile touched my lips. It was not a smile of warmth or amusement. It was the smile of a chess player who sees the board with perfect clarity and knows his opponent has just made a fatal, irreversible mistake. The smile seemed to unnerve Vanessa. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "What's so funny?" She snapped, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. I ignored her question and looked down at my own briefcase, the thin leather attaché case that had been by my side for 30 years. I rested my hand on it. "That was a very thorough presentation, Vanessa," I said, my voice calm and even a placid lake in the middle of her hurricane. "Very detailed, but you seem to have overlooked a few things." I paused, then lifted my gaze to meet hers. "I also have a few documents that I think we need to consider before any decisions are made." As if on cue, just as the last word left my lips, there was a firm, deliberate knock on the boardroom door. The sound was not loud, but in the tense silence of the room, it was as impactful as a gunshot. Vanessa flinched. Mark jumped slightly in his seat. Even Leo looked up from his phone, his bored expression replaced by one of surprise. I was the only one who didn't react. I had been expecting it. "Come in," I said, my voice carrying easily across the room. The door opened, and David Chen walked in. He was the picture of quiet professionalism, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his silver hair neatly combed. His face was a calm, neutral mask, giving nothing away. But his presence immediately changed the gravity in the room. This was no longer just a hostile family discussion. This was a legal proceeding. He carried a handsome, well-worn leather briefcase, the kind that held important documents, the kind that held consequences. Vanessa's eyes locked onto David, then onto the briefcase. The triumphant smirk vanished completely, replaced by a look of sharp, sudden confusion. A wrinkle of suspicion appeared between her eyebrows. This was not part of her script. This was an unexpected character walking onto her stage, and she didn't know his lines. I saw the flash of recognition and then panic in Mark's eyes. He knew exactly who David was. He knew David was not just some lawyer. He was my lawyer, my friend, a man of unimpeachable integrity and formidable skill. Mark sank a little lower in his chair, as if trying to make himself a smaller target. David closed the door quietly behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the silent room. He walked to the table with a steady, unhurried pace. He nodded once, a gesture of deep respect to me. "James," he said, his voice calm and clear. He then pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. He placed his briefcase on the polished walnut table, not with a thud, but with a soft, deliberate weight. The sound was quiet, but it was the sound of a gauntlet being thrown. The balance of power in the room had just fundamentally and irreversibly shifted. David opened his briefcase, and the soft clicks of the latches were the only sounds in the room. He did not pull out a large stack of papers. He removed a single, slender file folder. He placed it on the table in front of him, but he did not open it. He folded his hands on top of it and turned his calm, steady gaze not to me, but to Vanessa. "Mrs. Callahan," he began, his voice impeccably polite. "I have reviewed the proposal you have prepared. It is comprehensive." Vanessa, thrown off balance but attempting to regain control, narrowed her eyes. "It's a standard generational transfer, David. Surely you've seen hundreds of them. Now, if you'll just advise James on the relevant signature lines, we can conclude this." David offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "A transfer of this magnitude is never standard," he said smoothly. "It's about more than just assets and equity. It's about legacy. It's about heritage. It's about the continuation of a bloodline. These were matters of great importance to both James and the late Mrs. Callahan when they drafted the foundational documents for their estate." At the mention of bloodline, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Vanessa's face. Impatience, confusion. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. David opened the folder. He slid out a single sheet of paper, a copy of the original corporate charter for Callahan Interiors. He turned it around and pushed it across the table. His finger pointed to a specific paragraph. "I'd like to draw your attention to Article 7, Section B," he said. "A clause that Mrs. Clara Callahan herself insisted upon, I believe. It specifies that a controlling interest in the company, in the event of the founder's retirement or death, must pass to a direct lineal descendant of the Callahan bloodline." He then produced a second document, thicker and bound in blue. "And this," he said, his voice remaining level, "is the Callahan Family Trust, which governs the disposition of all personal assets, including the family home." The language here on page 12, paragraph 4, is even more specific. It names the sole beneficiary after the passing of both founders as the lawfully begotten issue of James Callahan. Lawfully begotten issue. Blood heir. These are not sentimental terms, Mrs. Callahan. They are legally binding directives. Vanessa stared at the documents, a look of dawning horror on her face. She was finally beginning to understand that this was not a negotiation. This was an execution. "This is ridiculous," she stammered, her voice rising. "Mark is his son, it's the same thing." David's gaze was unwavering. "In the eyes of the law, and in the precise language of these documents, it is the only thing that matters," he said. And due to the absolute importance of this clause, a final piece of due diligence was required before any transfer could be considered. From the folder, David produced one final item. It was a long white sealed envelope from a certified laboratory. It looked sterile, official, and utterly terrifying. He held it up for them all to see. "As an executor of the estate, and to ensure we are in full compliance with the explicit terms of the trust, I was legally obligated to confirm the beneficiary's standing," David said. He slit the envelope open with a small letter opener, the sound of the paper tearing a sharp rip in the fabric of the silence. He pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in technical data and legal certifications. He scanned it for a moment, his face impassive. Then he looked up, his gaze moving from Vanessa to Mark, who now looked like he was about to be physically ill. David cleared his throat. "This is the certified report from a genetic comparison analysis," he stated. "The results are conclusive." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on them, a crushing, unbearable pressure. And then he delivered the final, fatal blow. "The analysis confirms with a certainty of 99.999% that Mark Callahan shares no genetic markers with James Callahan. The probability of paternity," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "is 0%. The world stopped. For a full 5 seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then chaos erupted. Vanessa shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Lies!" she shrieked, her face contorted into a mask of pure rage. "This is a trick. You forged it. He's a bitter old man trying to cheat his own son." But her hysteria was a hollow sound, because one look at Mark told the real story. He didn't shout. He didn't protest. He simply collapsed. All the color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, ghastly white. His mouth hung open slightly, a silent O of absolute devastation. He stared at me, but his eyes were vacant, seeing nothing. He looked like a man whose entire skeleton had just been vaporized, leaving only a hollow shell of skin and clothes to slump in a chair. The foundation of his entire life, his name, his identity, had been obliterated in a single sentence. Even Leo was frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand, his jaw slack with disbelief. The prince had just discovered he was a pauper. David waited patiently for Vanessa's tirade to run out of steam. When she finally fell silent, panting for breath, he spoke again, his voice cutting through the aftermath like a surgeon's scalpel. "The document is legally certified, and the chain of custody for the samples is unimpeachable," he said calmly. The legal ramifications are therefore quite simple. As Mr. Mark Callahan is not a direct lineal descendant, he has no legal claim under the terms of the corporate charter. As he is not the lawfully begotten issue of James Callahan, he has no legal claim under the terms of the family trust. He is not the heir. He has no right to the company, no right to the house, and no right to any of the assets contained within the trust. He paused, then looked directly at Vanessa, his gaze cold as a winter morning. "Your entire proposal," he said, "is predicated on a falsehood. It is null and void." Vanessa stared at him, her rage dissolving into a horrifying, dawning comprehension. She had not just lost a negotiation. She had lost everything. Her ambition, her arrogance, her greed, it had all led her to march her family with absolute confidence right off the edge of a cliff. She had single-handedly destroyed the very future she had been so desperate to secure. And the look on her face was the look of a gambler who had bet it all on a single card, only to see it turn to ash in her hand. This story is a powerful reminder that the foundations of our lives must be built on truth, not just love. A secret held for nearly 50 years shows that even the deepest bonds can be based on a devastating illusion. But the ultimate lesson isn't about the pain of betrayal. It's about the quiet strength found in facing a terrible reality. It teaches us that when our world is shattered by a lie, we have two choices: to be a victim of the past, or to become the architect of a new future built upon the hard, solid ground of truth. What would you have done in James's position? Is it better for a devastating truth to be revealed, or for some secrets to be taken to the grave? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and please like and subscribe for more stories that make you think.